Good morning. It has been a little bit since we've done one of these. I've done one of these, and the few of you that watch them. Um, Had a lot of things going on. I've had some ups and downs in the physical, medical side of things in our lives. Our family's been dealing with quite a bit over the last year, but it's all been good. Good outcomes, positive things. We have really been provided for by God, and things are going great. Which leads me to kind of where my thought process is this morning. We in Christianity like to use some phrases that are not necessarily biblical, but they're not necessarily not biblical. Oftentimes, some good thoughts come out of the ministry, which is important. That's what the Bible intended. Paul's letters, Peter's letters, the majority of the New Testament were scripture written to answer questions with divine inspiration to the ministry who are answering said questions. That's how we got stuff. So not everything has to be biblical in that context. So one of those phrases that has really stuck out with me the last few days is that idea that God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And I think that on face value, we understand that you don't have to be perfect, that you don't have to be saved to get saved. Coming into the church is what you need. I have said it many, many times, and I will die on this hill. The church is not a museum of saints. It is a hospital for sinners, and that's what we should be. Your job in that church is to either be there to get help or be there to help give help. If you can't be there to help give help, then you need it. Or if you refuse, then you don't belong there. Plain and simple. That's the face value, but the reality of that in depth has a few more layers to it. Some of them we like and some of them we don't. The first thing I want to say about this concept is that God calls you to be you. God doesn't call you to be me. He doesn't call you to be like your pastor. He doesn't call you to be like your neighbor. To some degree, a pastor's ministry, an apostle, if you will have like followers. His ministry will be a representation of him, the same as your children are a representation of you, but they're not clones. They're not identical. And a true ministry has 5 gifts. According to the Bible, it says that there's apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, and evangelists. There's also many other gifts in the Bible that are listed out. Paul goes through those repeatedly and talks about how everybody doesn't have them. And that's kind of the point I'm getting to here, is that the first step of the qualifying the called is that you have to understand God called you to be you. We have a stained glass window interpretation of Christianity. We see the old Renaissance era pictures of Jesus and the apostles and the disciples, and their faces are angelic and the cherubims are soft and childlike, and the images are frail and weak, really. And that mentality has corrupted our mindset for generations about what it means to be myself in Christianity. Some of you are very humble, meek, naive, gentle people. Some of you are rough, you're loud, you're bold, you're aggressive, and you trust no one. Both of you belong in the church. Both of you belong here. Both of you belong following the calling that's placed on your life without trying to be the other. We have very, very clear pictures in the Bible of different personalities that God aligned himself with. David, for example, said that he was a man after God's own heart. But then we have Christ, who says to turn the other cheek. If you take the face value of that statement, or take the face value of what we've painted a picture of Christ, there is no way that he and David are like-minded. Because David was bold. David was a boy who killed a bear. He killed a lion. He rolled into the king's suite tent, the top guy in the land, and said, "Psh, I'll fight your giant." That's not a weak, meek, humble person. I'm not going to get into humility today. That's not what I'm getting at. It's not about being arrogant or confident. But he was bold. When he made mistakes, for the most part, they were because he was bold, but at no point was he scolded for being bold. He was a leader. David was qualified to kill Goliath, to face the Philistine, because he had been through some things. He had seen some stuff. He didn't go from his calling to slaying the giant to leading Israel. There were some things that happened to him. There were some things that he faced. There were some things that he dealt with that prepared him. So part of qualification is training. And in my world, training is super important. It's what I do every day for my profession. And training is often harder than reality. And it should be. Because you need to be able to be prepared for what you're really going to face and be confident you can face it because you've been through harder things. However, when we go through hard things and we go through rough stuff, we always sit back and say, I'm going through a trial. Maybe. Or I'm really being tested this week. Probably. Or the devil's been testing me. That's my favorite. Why do we always give credit to this guy, the devil, Satan, this outside evil force that's out here battling against us? The Bible says that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Everybody gets rained on. The difference is how wet you get under the umbrella of Christ, under the umbrella of your ministry, under the umbrella of your father, your family, the umbrella of God's government to protect you from the rain, but the rain still falls. So sometimes we have to understand that what we're going through right now is not a temptation of the devil. It's not a trial from Satan. It's not a test from the darkness. It's training. Sometimes we feel like it's the end of the world. It's the worst thing we've ever gone through. And it may very well be the hardest thing you've ever faced in your life today, may be happening to you right now. But tomorrow, you can look back and say that most difficult thing that you faced in your entire life is done. The hardest thing you ever faced today, like David in the field with his sheep, was a bear. But after he slayed the bear, he was able to say, I got past that. The hardest thing he'd ever faced the day he met the lion was the lion. But we know his story, and we know that things are way harder down the road. Things got way bigger down the road, and things got way more glorious down the road. But he didn't stop at the lion. He didn't lay down for the bear. He worked through it. So I want you to understand that sometimes your trials and your tests are not punishment or they're not discipline. They're not from an outside source. They're simply you're facing your day-to-day life, and you have the option to look the lion in the eye and allow him to eat you, or to step up, work the problem, and move forward. Sometimes in our lives, we allow the lions or the devils or whatever you want to call them that we face to own us. We allow them to give us their rule, their name. We take that on us when you don't have to. I've done it plenty of times. I started out my life with Tourette syndrome. Still have it. I hide it very well because I move around a lot, but I have it. I could very easily let that own me. At times, it has been very socially inhibiting. At times, it's been very painful. At times, it's put me in the hospital, but it doesn't own me. I have seen some of the darkest, most evil things in this world. It's time for another story. But I don't let them own me. I have. Some of them I've let them own me for a while, but I don't. I was able to get through that. I've even gotten through simple things like actual training or tests or education by knowing that other people I know have been through it and they got past it. And if that guy can do it or that young lady can do it, surely I can do that. Sometimes our trials are training. The second part of that, though, or the next part of that you have to understand, this is not just an evil thing happening to you. It's not just a bad thing. It's not just a test. It could be training. So we identify that it's training, and we're identify it's not going to own us. We're not going to end there. We're not going to die there. But then we get to the hard parts. And that's knowing why we had to go through that. I don't have an answer for you on that. Completely. What I can tell you is that those little battles, those little events, those little stressors in your life, they give you confidence when you overcome them. They give you an ability when you overcome them. They give you the next step of your role to overcome them. I'll give you an example. One of our biggest complaints with young people today, and I say young people this age of my children, their 20s, some of them, is they can't communicate. They're terrible communicators because they've spent their entire life with a computer in their hand where their line of communication is with their thumb. And I liken this story or this example, when my father wanted to go talk to a girl, he had to get on his bike and ride to her house and he had to knock on the door and wait for her dad to open the door and look him in the eye. That's a level of anxiety he faced at, we'll say 10 years old, 12 years old, that I didn't have to face. Myself, in that same age category, I didn't have to get on my bike. I picked up a phone, I dialed a number, and I waited. Same anxiety, slightly different pressure, because I knew that the voice that came over that phone when I heard it pick up was not going to be a young lady. It was going to be her father. And I had to work through that pressure, that anxiety, that lion, if you will. And some of them were lions and bears. But our children, when they want to talk to a girl, when my son, who's 10 years old, when he gets to that stage, he can just push a button on a phone and hide behind it and never face dad. The problem with that lack of training, that lack of test, that lack of trial, lack of anxiety and stress and struggle is that when he's one day going to be an adult, and I'm going to expect him, especially if he follows his father's line of work, to be able to go out here in the community, look a man in the eye who's going through their worst possible day ever, their worst lion, their worst bear, their worst trauma, look him in the eye and tell him he has to be accountable for his own actions. You want to know what the problem with young police officers are today? You know what the problem with communication, what the problem with escalation or de-escalation or all these other nonsense arguments everyone wants to make? You want to know what the real baseline problem of use of force in this country is? Suspects on the street, witnesses, victims, and young police officers, they all come from the same age category, and not a single one of them know how to communicate, because at no point in their life did they ever have to knock on the door and wait for daddy to answer. And the first time they face that stress, the first time they face that anxiety is in real life, when there are real stakes and real consequences of action. We did that as a society, and we've got to figure out how to fix it. We are holding people accountable and putting people at a level of pressure that we feel like we should be at, or our parents should have been at, without allowing them to have the tools and the training to get there. And I will side note that as parents, if you don't let your children fail, if you don't put them in situations where they are going to fail, if you don't let them know that it is their fault, in fact, when they fail, they are never going to be successful, upstanding, communicating, quality fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, sisters, brothers. Sports used to be an area where kids had to earn a spot. If they failed to earn a spot, go and work harder and come back and get that spot. They had to earn the ability to keep that spot. Then they had to learn, earn, and work hard to win in that spot. And at any point in time when those things broke down, they had to reevaluate what mistakes they made, what they learned, and what they need to do to move forward. The very little in sports anymore has anything to do with that. So it even becomes more incumbent on the home for you to do that. Your kids are going to fail. Allow them to fail. Hold them accountable. Teach them to be accountable with grace and move forward. Part of those trials, tests, lions, bears that you fight is to learn discipline. Discipline is an act of the will. Whether it comes from God the Father, whether it comes from you the father or you the mother, when you discipline your children, you're not just punishing them, you are disciplining them. That secondary portion of that trial and that test and that era is, what did I learn? What do I need to learn? How can I do better? And what did I do right? All of those things come out of that, and it takes discipline to continue to work on the weaknesses, to not allow the good things to falter and to move forward. As adults, I hear all the time, I just don't have the motivation to work out. I don't have the motivation to go to the store today. I don't have the motivation to clean the house. Motivation is not discipline. Discipline is an act of the will, much like love. Love one another. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. Those things are based on acts of the will, conscious decisions that your lions and your bears and your snakes and spiders and whatever, all tiny little things that are less than that, are not going to own you. You're going to have the discipline to step on them and continue to move forward, even when you don't feel like it. Motivation is lust. Motivation is a temporary excitement. Music can get you motivated. Pre-workout can get you motivated. Caffeine can get you motivated. Watching a fired up video can get you motivated. But it's lust. It's over in a flash. You can't beat lions and bears with lust. You can beat snakes. You can step on spiders. But eventually one of those things is going to get you. Because you didn't grow. You didn't learn. You didn't work. It is incumbent upon the leadership of the church, the leadership of our communities, the leadership of our families, to allow you to fail, to grow, to face the lions and the bears, to take step by step by step. Sometimes they are not going to go the way you want. Sometimes one of the sheep is going to get eaten. But it's okay, because there's a process to that. Now back to who we are. Just because you beat the lion doesn't mean you're David. So we know in the Bible that David slayed a lion. We also know that Samson slayed a lion. But aside from the differences in what happened in their life and their story, what is their position in God's whole story, this book? Samson was never king. He was a judge, but he was never king. And then there's another guy. In 1 Chronicles 11, Benaiah. Benaiah was singled out. He was identified as a great warrior amongst David's warriors. But Benaiah wasn't a judge. Benaiah wasn't a king. And most of you, until this very moment, if you're watching this video, have never heard his name, or when you read your Bible in 365 days, you scanned through it, you saw it a couple times because so-and-so begot so-and-so, and so-and-so begot so-and-so, and that's super boring. And then you got to 1 Chronicles, and you read about the Jebusites, and you read about the fortress of David, and that was a crazy cool story. But then you got into him identifying his generals, and you were back to, oh, this is just some so-and-so begot so-and-so, so you skipped over this. But there's this guy named Benaiah, and so Benaiah was a warrior. Not only did he slay a lion, he killed 2 Moabite generals, and he killed an Egyptian that the Bible said was roughly 7 feet tall, by taking away his weapon from him and killing him with it. Benaiah is my kind of guy. Benaiah is a bad dude. But he is so irrelevant to Christianity. He's so irrelevant to Judaism. He is so irrelevant to the entire complexity of the Bible that most of you have never heard his name. He went through the same trials. He took the same steps. But his calling in life was just to be one of David's warriors, not to be King David. We look in the New Testament. We have trials, we have tribulations, we have tests, we have training, and we have personalities. Look at Peter. Peter was another guy who Jesus and God clearly loved. He was chosen, he was given the keys to the kingdom, if you will. At one point later in life, he's referred to as the chief apostle. But Peter was rough, he was tough, he liked to fight. He wasn't soft and meek and humble. How many times was Peter rebuked for speaking out? How many times did Jesus say, hey, step to the back. Shut your mouth. Stop questioning me. All the time with you. He went through that. To the point, he was such a brash individual that when the soldiers came to the garden to take Jesus, Peter drew a sword, gave a downward glancing blow, and cut a man's ear off. So a couple things about that I think very, very interesting that we don't talk about very often. The first thing is that the reason Peter had a sword is because Jesus told him to get a sword. He wasn't carrying concealed. Jesus said, go buy some swords. That's not the soft-spoken, angelic figure that we portray all of the early church to be. Jesus said, go get some weapons. What happened was an entire battalion rolled into the garden, and you've got some people sleeping. You've got a young boy, probably Mark, takes off running. He's a small child. I'm sure some other people probably fled. And you got basically the apostles in the garden with Christ. Peter's ready to go. This is it. Suicide mission. I'll give my life for everybody here. But Jesus knew it wasn't Peter's calling to be sacrificed then. It wasn't his time to be martyred. It wasn't his time to face tribulation. It wasn't his time to be tortured, because those places of calling, those steps, those requirements were on Jesus. And that was his calling in that day, not Peter's. So instead he told Peter to put down his sword. We know the story. He picks up an ear, he puts it back on the soldier, and I can't help but wonder if that's not the first moment that we meet a future man who will encounter Peter again. Because if anybody in the Bible in my mind, as a Gentile, as a Roman soldier, would later find himself hosting a Bible scripture prayer meeting in his home, and the origin of the Gentile dispensation, the Gentile church, it would be the guy who stood in the garden, who came to kill Jesus, only to find, once his face had been sliced off, that Jesus placed it back and restored it. It's my belief that Cornelius first met Jesus, or at least we know that he first met Jesus in the garden. That began his walk and calling. That began his spot. And being a Roman soldier, attempted murder of Christ, he definitely wasn't qualified. But Peter slipped up the other way. Peter had a little window where he wasn't bold. He had a little window where he wasn't willing to die. He had a little window where he wasn't willing to stand on that hill and fight everybody in the entire world. The biggest failure moment in Peter's life was when he denied Christ 3 times in the judgment sections. Because for the first time that we see in Peter's story, he's not the rough, tough, bad warrior dude. In Matthew 14, he's the one that led on the water. John 18, like I said, he's the one that swung the sword. Later, we find him in John 20, when John is standing outside of the empty tomb, afraid to step in. Peter walks right in. On Acts 2, Peter prophesied the day of Pentecost. In Acts 8, Peter goes to Samaria after Philip had evangelized. He took John too, but Peter went. In Acts 10, I believe he goes back to that Roman soldier's house who lost his ear, and he began to preach, and he said he knew that the Holy Spirit had fell upon them because they began to speak in other tongues as he yet spake. The church of his prophecy from Acts 2 of all of Judea and all of Israel and all of Samaria and the othermost parts of the world was solidified when Peter went forward. In Acts 11, he actually went back to the church and defended his position. Again, quite arrogant, very bold, very aggressively. Peter was not called to be a stained glass window. And actually, when he tried to be the stained glass somewhat, is when he failed. All of those tests, all those trials, all those things that he went through, they were to continue to build who he was, not to change who he was from being bold to being weak. Paul, when he was Saul, he did some things. Much like Cornelius, he was on the wrong side of the line when it came to Jesus and the church. I have a belief about Paul, and it ties into all of this. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul said that he had a thorn in his side. And he said that he's asked God 3 times to remove the thorn, and God said, nope, for my grace is sufficient. So here's what I want to propose to you today with Paul. Here's what I've been getting to. These trials, these tests, these lions, these bears, these enemies we face, the things that are going through, the struggles, drugs, alcohol, adultery, marriage problems, stress, money, misbehaving children, the education system, politics, the government, our jobs, our professions, our retirement, whatever it is. Your lion may be that you're addicted to heroin and you don't know what to do because you go through withdrawals every 2 hours without a dose. My lion has never been that. Some people get this idea that, again, we all have to be the same to be in the church. So it even goes the other way, that our unqualified moments have to be the deepest, darkest, most seedy levels of society. There are people that have grown up, been raised in the church you're sitting in right now, next to you on the pew every single service their entire life, that are going through just as many deep, dark lions, demons, and bears as the drug addict on the corner, but they very rarely get edification, because their problems aren't real problems, but they're real problems. What I will say to you is that lion, that bear, becomes a thorn in your side when you allow it to own you. Anxiety, depression, mental illness, physical illness, cancer, drug addiction, any of those things that you have faced, debt, bankruptcy, poverty, wealth, riches, any of those things, they become your lion, you become your bear. They become those things that are meant to qualify you, or meant to train you, but you instead allow them to own you. They become a thorn. This is the part that nobody really likes to hear. God said he would not take away the thorn. Not everything you go through, not every pain that you face, not every struggle and trial and temptation and lion and bear that stands before you is God going to deliver you from in this life. Not everybody gets delivered. Not everything goes away. Because sometimes the combination of a continued reminder of where you came from, a continued reminder that you are capable of falling there again, a continued feeling that you have to battle and deal and address something on a daily basis to keep it under wraps, make that conscious act of the will of discipline, is necessary for you as an individual. Because you are called to be you, and sometimes you can easily go astray without feeling that grain. Some of you need continued discipline in yourself. I do. I deal with things. I just don't allow them to own me, because God said his grace is sufficient. And there are times that they do own me in my mind, and I have to step back and I have to open the book and I have to go, what is it that I need to do to get to the next step? There are days I don't want to get out of bed. There are nights I cannot sleep. There are nights I dream the worst nightmares I could dream. And everyone that's ever been in my career field in law enforcement goes through that. And I promise you, if they don't, or they tell you don't, they're a liar. And they're allowing that lion to beat them. But I don't allow that to stop me, because God said my grace is sufficient. What was Paul's thorn? No one knows. He didn't say. Here's what I think. Back when he was unqualified, back when he was on the other side, there was a young man named Stephen who had shown himself through his own lions, his own bears, his own acts of the will to be worthy of the church declaring him to be a deacon to take care of the widows in the city. Now, in those days, Stephen was considered a great young man, because the other men that were called to be deacons with him were not teenage boys. They were ministers. They were men who had shown themselves approved. And theologically and historically, there is a belief that although all that happens in one chapter in the book of Acts, Stephen's career as a deacon, as a young preacher, where he was called, most likely around 12 and 13 years old, lasted for 4 or 5 years. So for 4 or 5 years, this young teenage preacher who was super hot out here prophesying and leading the church, it was a big deal. It'd be a big deal for us. And here comes this guy Saul, and he murders him. And we know that Stephen was such a great big deal to Jesus that it's we get this image upon his death that he looks towards the heavens, and Jesus Christ, who is sitting at the right hand of the Father, stood in honor of the murder of this child, this young boy, this young preacher. So if I was Paul, and if I could liken myself to Paul in any category, after he was struck off his donkey, he was blinded and he was saved, and God called him and began his qualification process, what thing would he carry with him as a thorn in his side for the rest of his life? If I was Paul, guilt, unimaginable shame, guilt, depression, anxiety. Every time when we make mistakes and we do bad things and it gets brought up again, what's the first feeling we feel? Anxiety. When we see the people that we wronged, or the family members of the people we wronged, or we're in the room with the people that we interacted with during that mistake time, that sinful era, whatever it is that we did, anxiety that it's going to come up. I don't want to talk about it. It's uncomfortable. This guy's the leader of the church. Everywhere he goes, they want to talk to him about the church and the people in the church. Everybody wanted to talk about Stephen. If he had anything as a thorn to carry the rest of his life, it's this. That boy was intended to be the leader of the Gentile church. At least in Paul's mind, and likely in mine. That boy was on the career trajectory to be the chief apostle. But he was struck down in his youth by Paul, and then God said, I'm going to use the man who killed him to take his seat and lead this church. Because of grace and temperance. God's grace got him through that day. God's grace allows him to carry that as a part of his calling and his place and his qualification, but daily he has to overcome that mark. Daily he had to be disciplined spiritually to not allow what then was a giant. It wasn't a lion and a bear. Killing Stephen was a giant in his life, to own him. So I said all of that to say this today. Whatever it is that you're facing as a trial, whatever you feel like God's punishing you for, whatever you feel like Satan is tempting you with, whatever it is that's just the daily grind of life that's got you stressed beyond control. Look back at yesterday, or look back at last year, look back at your time in this life, and I want you to tell yourself when you slayed the lion. I want you to look at your King Saul and say, but King, I beat the lion, I beat the bear. I overcame cancer. I overcame hate. I overcame being abandoned. I overcame being broke. I got through that car accident. I got through that injury. I got through that trauma. The violence that happened in my home doesn't own me. The violence that happened in front of me doesn't own me. The mental illness that runs in my family doesn't own me. The post-traumatic stress disorder I have doesn't own me. The cancer that lives in my body doesn't own me. None of them are going to be the thorn that strikes me down. They may be a thorn and I may never be delivered. But daily I will beat that lion. Daily I will slay that bear. Daily I will look that giant in the eye, and I will know two things. God is preparing me for something bigger. I can overcome today because I overcame yesterday. And at the very end of the day, the entire point of this process is not to punish and beat me down. It's to train me for the glory and the greatness of the future. God is training his people to be prepared for what's next, to be able to be a part of the true body of Christ. Ephesians 4:16 says he joined us together, every ligament, every part. Fingers are not toes. Ears are not eyes. Some of you are called to be David. Some of you are going to be Paul. Some of you are going to be Peter. And I'm going to tell you, the higher your calling, the more likely you're going to have to fight a lot of lions and a lot of bears to get there, because you're going to need the most training. Some of you are called to simply be Cornelius and open the door and never be heard from again. Some of you are going to be Benaiah, who's going to have a tiny little footnote in the chapter of the history of the church, even though you had to fight the same lions and bears as everyone else. God called you to be you. He called me to be me. We are going to go through trials and tests, and we are going to fight lions and bears to improve who we are, to improve our contribution to His church, and to get stronger. And some of us are going to have to do it every single day. But that's okay, because His grace is sufficient, and He called you to be you. He does not call the qualified, but in fact He does, because He qualifies every single one of us He's called. My prayer for you today is that if you are looking at the eyes of a lion or a bear, or you're standing before the giant, you remember His grace is sufficient, and that He carried you through yesterday. He will carry you through tomorrow. And each time that you have to fight this battle, you're going to get a little bit stronger. You're going to get a little bit closer to understanding the why. If it owns you and it's become the thorns that have wrapped around your head, remember that He took those thorns. He wore that crown. They don't belong to you. They may be in your side. You may have one, but you're not allowed to wear that crown. You're not allowed to let that crown of thorns own you. That was His. Let Him have it. If you need help, if you need prayer, if you need somebody to talk to and vent your lions, somebody to work through your problems, somebody just to listen about how you failed, look me up, because I can promise you there's not a whole lot of those lions and bears out there that I hadn't fought. Some of them I'm fighting today. I'm not a stained glass. I got scars on my knuckles. I got scars on my heart. I got scars in my brain. I have things I have not let go of. I have thorns that I carry too much, that I put too much emphasis on. Each day requires that level of discipline to remember that mercy and to remember that God called me to be me. And all of those mistakes and failures and times in my life have been training periods. I'm here for you. I do love you. Christ loves you. And I hope that you guys have a great week and are embodied with strength and power and renewed. Thank you.